Hello, hello, and welcome. Welcome on into the Swear Word. I'm your host, Brendan Swear, and this is a podcast for the chiliad community by the chiliad community. Regardless of your spice tolerance, this is the place for you. Up tonight, we have an amazing episode on deck. We're going to be diving into pest resistance within the garden. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about lessons from the pepper fields for the organic and conventional growers here, talking about some of these issues. So let's do this. Let's jump on into episode 191. What's going on, Swear Nation? So glad to have everyone here. Whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Spotify, Rumble, and or Apple Podcasts, thank you so much for being here and continuing to make this podcast what it is. Up tonight, we're going to be diving in and stepping away from the sauce side of things just for a minute. We're going to dive deeper into something that affects every pepper grower and really every gardener and every farmer out there. Honestly, really any person that enjoys fresh produce is impacted by this, because whether you realize it or not, there's a battle happening in your garden or fields and really all over the world. And that battle isn't the weather, it isn't the soil, and it isn't watering, it's adaptation, specifically pest resistance. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and jump on into tonight's discussion. Pest resistance. Now, that phrase sounds technical, but don't let that scare you, because the concept is actually simple. Imagine that you had a lock on your front door, and over time, somebody kept trying keys until eventually one worked. Now, imagine that happening thousands, millions, and even billions of times. That is basically what pests are doing. Every time we use the exact same prevention method over and over, whether that's synthetic chemicals, organic sprays, fungicides, or even certain growing habits, we're unintentionally creating a test that eventually something survives. And when it survives, it passes that advantage forward. Suddenly, the thing that worked last season doesn't work anymore. And people end up saying, why are these pests getting worse? The answer isn't always more pests. Sometimes they're just getting smarter. Well, maybe not smarter, but adapted. And today, we're going to be specifically talking through the lens of peppers. But this applies to tomatoes, eggplants, cucumbers, commercial farming, backyard gardens, organic systems, hydroponics, and beyond. So today, we're covering how resistance actually develops, the hidden costs that are happening to your crops, what occurring prevention methods really do, and why organic and conventional growers both face this problem. And most importantly, what can we actually do about it? And by the end of this episode, my goal is simple. I want you walking away with a practical strategy that you can apply this season. So go ahead, grab a notebook, open your notes app, or just sit back and listen, and let's grow smarter. All right, so let's start with the obvious question. What is actually happening? Why are growers everywhere talking more and more about resistance? Well, the answer starts with the understanding of one very important idea. Nature never stops adapting, and pests adapt faster than most of us even think. Take some of the common enemies of pepper growers: aphids, thrips, spider mites, flea beetles, and diseases like Phytophthora. Now, you've probably never heard that word before, and don't worry, I also might have mispronounced it, but here is a simple version. Now, think of Phytophthora as a microscopic organism that attacks the roots and the lower parts of the plants. Many people describe this as a plant version of rot or collapse. You can have a healthy looking plant and then suddenly wilting, yellow, and eventually the collapse of the plant. Sometimes growers start to assume that they're either underwatering or I overwatered or it got too hot outside, but sometimes the problem really is underground. So now let's talk about the insects. Thrips. These tiny insects can spread plant viruses. So think of them almost like flying needles. They feed, they move, they feed again, and sometimes they carry disease from plant to plant. Next, everyone's familiar with these, aphids. These tiny little sapsuckers, the simple explanation of them is imagine somebody's attaching a tiny straw directly into your plant and drinking the nutrients out. That's essentially what they're doing. Then you have spider mites. Sure, they're small, but they are fast at reproducing. They're hard to see, and they absolutely love dry conditions. Now, where does resistance enter? Okay, so let's talk about it. You start to spray, let's call it product A. Most pests die, but maybe, just maybe, one of those survive. That one survivor, now it's reproducing. Now that offspring start to inherit that tolerance. And you spray product A again, more survivors. Repeat this enough times, and suddenly product A becomes almost useless. This process, that selection, it's called natural selection. And if that phase feels intimidating, here's the easiest explanation. Nature rewards what survives. That's it. Whatever survives gets another chance. And eventually, survivors become the majority. This isn't theory. This has been documented all over agriculture. Now, something important, this is not just only happening to, say, conventional farmers. Organic farmers, this also applies to us. Because sometimes there's a misunderstanding here. People assume that if it's organic, it can't create resistance. Well, that's absolutely not true. Resistance can happen in many different systems. For example, organic growers might rely heavily on neem oil or BT, which is short for Bacillus thuringiensis. A simple explanation of this is BT is naturally occurring bacteria that is used to target certain insects. Think of it as a biological tool. Very useful, but something that needs thoughtful use. Things like copper fungicides or soap sprays, oils, repeated overuse can create pressure too. Conventional growers often face this with synthetic insecticides and fungicides. They are ultimately different tools, but the same risk. Now, here's another important term, mode of action. A simple explanation for mode of action means how a product works. It's not all about the brand. It's not about the bottle that it comes in. The actual mechanism here. Does it disrupt the nerves? Does it disrupt the growth? Does it disrupt feeding, reproduction? This mode of action, this becomes important because rotating products that all work the exact same way is not rotating. You're changing labels, not changing strategy. So you'll often hear references to the IRAC groups. IRAC stands for Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. A simple explanation here for that is think of IRAC groups like categories. Products in different groups attack pests differently. Changing groups reduce selection pressure. So here's another example, and simply only an example. Let's say Green Valley Farms sprays product alpha repeatedly every single week. The same chemistry, the same timing. At first, amazing results. A month later, much less effective. The next season, now you're into major problems. Now imagine instead they rotated products. They introduced beneficial insects. They improved the spacing between plants. They monitored before spraying. Suddenly, resistance develops much, much slower. That right there is the difference. Now, here's the big idea I want you to remember, though. Pests aren't always trying to beat us. They're not evolving because they're evil. They simply are responding to pressure. And if we understand that, we can design better systems, which bring us into our next section, the resistance treadmill. And trust me, this is where things get expensive. We're talking about the pitfalls of overuse of the same preventative. So now that we understand how the resistance develops, let's talk about where people accidentally get themselves into trouble. Because this is usually not intentional, and most people aren't out there trying to create resistance to pests. They're just trying to save their plants. They see damage and they respond to it. That makes sense. But over time, good intentions can create bad systems. And there's actually a name for this. It's the resistance treadmill. And once you hear this, you'll probably recognize it too. Here's how it usually goes. You notice the pests, you spray for them. Results are great. Next week, they come back. So you go, what do? You go over there and you spray again. Still decent results. The numbers do start to creep up just a little bit. So maybe you increase the frequency. Maybe that's just it. Wait. Or maybe you just up the concentration. Maybe you buy a stronger product, or just maybe you start combining all these products together. Eventually, you find yourself spending more, working harder, and getting much worse results. That is the treadmill. More effort, less return. Now, if this sounds familiar to you, you're not alone. This happens everywhere. Backyards, greenhouses, commercial acreage, organic systems, conventional systems, indoor grows, outdoor grows, every single one of us are vulnerable. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Because pests aren't the only thing affected. No, there is a collateral effect here, meaning the other parts of your growing environment start getting impacted too. And one of the first casualties, well, you've probably discovered it. It's the beneficial insects. So now, if you're new to gardening and you're like, what's going on? What are beneficial insects? Beneficial insects are basically your unpaid workforce. They are the insects that are there to help control pest populations. Ladybugs, lacewings, predatory mites, parasitic wasp, hoverflies, minute pirate bugs, and yes, some of these names sound terrifying, but many are incredibly valuable. A simple explanation here for this, or think of like beneficial bugs are like security guards for your garden. They patrol, they hunt, and they reduce outbreaks. And the problem with the broad spectrum treatments is, especially repeated use here, is that they don't always distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys. So now your natural defenders, they disappear. And you're sitting there going, what happens next? Then you have a secondary breakout, meaning you solved one problem and accidentally created another one. So here's another example for you. Once again, example only here. So let's say a generic pepper company has an aphid issue. They spray heavily, the aphids decrease. I know what you're thinking, great success, but their beneficial insects also disappear. 2 weeks later, spider mites explode, and now they need another treatment. Now they're reacting instead of managing. The cycle gets expensive. But now let's talk environment, because this conversation gets emotional sometimes. And I want to keep this practical. So everything has its trade-offs. Conventional tools, organic tools, natural tools, mechanical tools, nothing is completely consequence-free. Repeated treatments can impact things like the soil microbes, your earthworms, pollinators, and the overall biological diversity. A simple explanation, think of healthy soil like a city. You want construction workers, electricians, and cleanup crews, transportation, communication, but soil microbes do all of that. So when the system loses diversity, things can still function, sure, but usually less efficiently. Another overlooked issue is the regulatory and market pressure. Now, this matters more commercially. So some buyers and retail chains, export programs, and specialty markets may have stricter expectations around residues. And for organic producers, certification standards matter too, meaning your choices upstream affect opportunities downstream. Now, here's one of the biggest pitfalls that no one really likes talking about: false security. This one gets everybody eventually. When a treatment works, you stop looking, you stop scouting, you assume everything is fine with that plant. Meanwhile, the problem, it starts to grow quietly. A simple explanation here is scouting is a means of regularly inspecting your plants, not just simply walking by them. You actually need to get there, looking under the leaves, checking the stems, looking for patterns, catching problems early. That is scouting. And honestly, most successful growers that I know aren't necessarily the best sprayers. They're the best observers. Now, let's talk about backyard growers. This applies to us too. It's easy to think it's only 6 pepper plants, but resistance doesn't really care about that. Your neighbor's garden, the community garden, a shared environmental pressure is happening all around, and it does not matter. Those small decisions, they scale. And this thing brings us into the next question here. What does all this actually cost? Because resistance doesn't just affect pests, it also affects yield, it affects your time, money, quality, and, of course, your expectations. So now let's talk about the consequences here. Because resistance isn't just annoying, it becomes expensive. And sometimes those costs, they show up slowly. First, the crop itself, pest damage on the peppers in a lot of different ways, leaf distortion, you got things like curling, scarring, reduced flowering, fruit defects, virus transmission, reduced overall plant vigor. And now, if you're newer, plant vigor simply means the overall strength and health. So how well the plant grows, how well it recovers, it produces, and the resistance to stress. Now, depending on severity, the yield can become less significant. And here's the important thing. Yield doesn't only mean quantity. It means usable product. So you might have the harvest of the same number of peppers, but if the quality drops, so does your value. A scarred pepper, a mishap of a pepper, some sun damage, a disease-marked pepper may not sell the same, and that does matter. Now conventional systems have their own risks. One word that you'll hear here is phytotoxicity. That's the plant damage caused by treatment. So think things like leaf burn, discoloration, growth slowdown, stress, and sometimes growers think these pests, they're getting way worse. But in reality, the plant got stressed by treatment, by the heat, by timing, by mix rates, environmental conditions. All of this matters. Another example here is thinking of, and once again, example only, generic Valley Farms starts to spray mid-afternoon. Let's say it's 95 degrees out. The plant's Well, of course, they're already stressed. 3 days later, you got leaf burn. And now the grower thinks, I got disease. But the application timing was the problem. Now, for an organic system, they also have trade-offs. People hear natural and they assume that it's unlimited uses. Well, that's not really the case. Things like neem oil, soaps, copper, repeatedly can still stress some systems. Copper especially deserves this discussion because copper doesn't just simply disappear over time, it can accumulate. And excess accumulation may influence the overall beneficial organisms. So let's talk about the economics here because this part gets real fast. At first, you're thinking preventative products, they're often just looked at as efficient, less labor intensive, higher yields, you're going to be able to have quick control, and that feels great. But resistance changes the math here. Now you can buy more products and you can apply them more often and you can spend more time mixing them and more time scouting, more time troubleshooting. Meanwhile, results, they're declining. And there's another hidden cost, which is ultimately decision fatigue. A simple explanation here is that every problem requires your mental energy. You're sitting there at the store, you're looking over everything you see online. You're going, what product? What's the timing? What's the weather conditions need to be for me to be able to use this product? At what rates am I going to be using this? How am I going to be mixing it? Is it safe? What caused the problem that I'm seeing? All this adds up. Backyard growers feel this too. You lose a seedling, you lose weeks, you lose momentum, and you lose excitement. Commercial growers, well, go ahead, multiply that acreage. Now you're talking some serious numbers, thousands, sometimes even more. And here's the thing I think deserves saying. Not every preventative is bad, and that's not the lesson here. Prevention is power, but prevention without strategy becomes dependency. And a healthy system usually creates resilience, meaning they can absorb stress without collapsing. And that's the big goal. It's not to be perfect, it's resilience, which leads us perfectly into this next section here, because now we start discussing solutions. How can conventional growers reduce the overall resistance without sacrificing production? And how to start using these powerful tools without creating bigger problems later on. So now that we've talked through the overall problem, we've talked about what resistance is, we've talked about the hidden costs, let's go ahead and shift these gears a little bit here because I think this next section is pretty important. If you're a conventional grower, this is not the part where I tell you stop using chemistry. That's not realistic. That's not helpful. And honestly, this is not really the most successful operations of work. The goal isn't eliminating tools. The goal is building upon a system that you're using. And one of the most important systems in agriculture today is called Integrated Pest Management, or IPM for short. A simple explanation of what IPM is IPM means using multiple strategies together. Instead of expecting one product to just solve everything, think of IPM like building layers of defense. Instead of one lock on your house, you have two locks. You have lights, cameras, your neighbors, and good habits. If one thing fails, everything doesn't collapse. That right there, that is the mindset. Now, the first tool inside IPM, and maybe even the most underrated, that's scouting. And I know scouting isn't exciting. Nobody posts glamorous scouting photos of themselves. Nobody brags, oh, hey guys, I inspected leaves today. But scouting wins seasons. Scouting means intentionally observing, not just walking by your plants, not checking from 20 feet away, but actually looking under the leaves. You got growing tips, flowers, stem junctions, fruit, the root zone, if at all possible, if you can see anything exposed. A simple explanation here is you're looking for the trends, not perfection. You're looking for, is there a few aphids? Maybe that's a different response. Is it an entire colony? Hey, that could be a completely different response then. Is it just one leaf damaged? Well, there's a different response for that. 30 damaged plants? As you can imagine by now, there's a different response for that. And that leads us into another important term, economic threshold. This means, at what point does treatment cost less than doing nothing? Because not every pest needs intervention. And while that's difficult emotionally, growers see pests and they want to take action. Some of you want to go out there and set your whole grow on fire just to get those aphids and take them on out. But action isn't always an improvement. So here's another example here. Let's say that Organic Pepper Farms finds 3 flea beetles, immediately treats them, broad spectrum spray, kills all the beneficials. Now secondary pests start to emerge and the problem becomes bigger than the original issue. Sometimes patience is productive. Let's start to talk about some of the rotation aspects here. This might be the single biggest resistance prevention tool. Rotation of your modes of action. Remember earlier how we were talking modes of action mean how the products work, not the brands, not the bottle, not the marketing, not any of that. It's really about the actual biological mechanisms. If you rotate products that all attack pests the same way, you're not rotating, you're repeating. Imagine someone trying to open your front door. If they try 10 different keys, that's variety. If they try the same key painted 10 different colors, that's not. Plants and pests don't care about the labels on your bottle or your bag. They respond to the chemistry. So rotate thoughtfully and make sure that you're doing it in the proper timing. Another major tool is resistance varieties. And this one gets overlooked because it doesn't feel exciting. But sometimes genetics solve problems before they ever start. You'll see descriptions mention resistance or tolerance. Some examples of those would be like TVM, tobacco mosaic virus. These are bacterial spots, root disease tolerance. And now a quick clarification here is resistance doesn't mean immunity. Resistance means that the plant can handle pressure better, not that nothing is going to happen. Think of like a rain jacket. It's not a force field. You still want good practices. So let's talk about the cultural controls. This is one of my favorite categories because often it's inexpensive and it's things like crop rotation, sanitation, spacing, mulching, water management, airflow. Cultural controls means changing the conditions so that the pests struggle. For example, if you have the crop rotation, you don't grow peppers in the exact same location year after year, if possible. Many pests and diseases survive locally. Spacing out the plants, because of course, crowded plants create humidity. Humidity creates opportunity. And then if you're indoors, and also applies if you're outdoors, things like sanitation. You're removing diseased debris, old plant material becomes housing for these pests, and reflective mulch. This is an interesting one here because simply reflective surfaces can confuse certain flying pests. and reduce the overall landings of these. It's pretty clever. Now, let's talk a little bit about the biological integration of this all. Conventional doesn't mean anti-biological. More growers are combining a little bit of selective chemistry, beneficial insects, and biological products, along with timing, precision, and this hybrid approach, this is growing. And finally, timing. This matters more than people realize. You want to treat the vulnerable stages, not just the peak outbreaks. Early intervention usually beats aggressive intervention. The goal isn't winning one battle. The goal is keeping your system functioning. So let's move over to the organic side, because there are incredible tools available too, and some of them might actually start to surprise you. Now, when people hear organic, they often imagine no intervention, and that's really not it. Organic systems can be extremely proactive, extremely strategic, and honestly, some organic growers are among the strongest observers that I've ever met. Because when you rely on more heavily on the overall prevention, you learn to notice the small changes quickly. Now, if I had to summarize a successful organic system in one sentence, it would be simply this: build an environment where healthy plants have advantages. That is the foundation. And everything starts underground. I know you've heard it many times here. Soil health. Soil health gets talked about consistently, but there is an absolute reason for that. Healthy soil improves water movement, nutrient availability, microbial diversity, and stress recovery, root development. I mean, the list goes on and on. But healthy soil works like a savings account. You build reserves before problems ever happen. So I know what you're thinking now. How do people even build that? You use things like compost, cover crops, reduced disturbances to the overall soil, or you add in organic matter. You work in some rotations. You start to incorporate diversity. Now, let's talk a little bit about the overall biological controls here, though. This is one of my favorite categories because things like predatory mites, ladybugs, parasitic wasps, beneficial nematodes. Beneficial nematodes are like microscopic organisms that hunt certain soiled pests. So think of them as like underground hunters. Then you have things like parasitic wasp, which sure sound a little bit scary, but many are tiny and absolutely harmless to people. Their target pest is the overall population here. And now here's something that's important to know, though, about these biological controls. They usually work best before disasters, not after. Think prevention. You're not sending them in there for the rescue. So let's move into the cultural and mechanical controls here. You have things like row covers, physical exclusion. You have trap crops, hand removal of pests, companion planting. Now, companion planting gets debated, but here's the simple explanation. Companion planting means placing plants together that may support the overall system's balance. Think of things like marigolds, basil, flowers for pollinators, different types of herbs. Now, think of some things that you want to avoid. You want to avoid expecting that it's going to be a miracle. Think more along the lines of support, not magic. Now, to discuss the overall approved organic products, you have things like neem oil, BT, spinosad, microbial fungicides, horticultural oils, soap, products. And again, organic doesn't mean unlimited. You want to be focused on rotation. You want to be focused on your observations. You want to make sure that you are adapting to the situation. So let's talk about, possibly, if it calls for it, some more aggressive organic approaches. And what does that mean? What do you do when pressure gets serious? First, you start to increase your monitoring. You shorten the inspection intervals. Second, you're going to stack biological releases and multiply the beneficial groups. Third, you're going to raise the sanitation standards and remove any kind of infected material faster than before. Fourth, you're going to be focused on biofumigation. Think of this as like certain cover crops that release compounds into the soil that may suppress some of these pests and disease. Things like mustard crops are commonly discussed, and think of like the plant-powered resistance or a plant-powered reset here. Another approach would be stem or thermal control, heat treatments, treated applications. Again, systems are dependent on this. And then there's things like grafting. You combine one plant's roots with another plant's fruiting producing ability. You get a strong root system and the desired peppers that you want. Together, it's pretty incredible how that works. And here's the thing that surprises really a lot of people over time is long-term, the organic systems can become incredibly resilient. Not because they eliminate problems, but because they distribute pressure. They add more diversity, there's more checks and balances, and they become much more less dependent on one single solution. And honestly, that's the theme of the whole episode. If you haven't figured it out, it's about resilience, not perfection. Because perfection doesn't exist, but resilience, those systems survive the change. And in our final section, we're going to be bringing both worlds together because whether you're growing conventionally, organically, or maybe somewhere in between, there are universal principles that help prevent resistance. We've covered how resistance develops, the pitfalls of the treadmill, the real costs, and particular solutions for both conventional and organic systems. So let's kind of bring this all together for the most part now. How do you actually prevent the resistance from taking hold? Whether you're managing hundreds of acres or just 6 pepper plants on a balcony, the good news here is the same core principles work at every scale. You don't need fancy equipment or a degree in entomology. You need consistency, observation, and a little variety in your approach. Here are the universal strategies that slow or stop resistance before it becomes a crisis. First, diversify your tactics. Never rely on a single tool, product, or method for too long. This is the golden rule. Rotate your crops, rotate your modes of action, rotate your varieties, and layer different controls. Simple explanation here is just think of it like never using the exact same password for every account. One breach doesn't take down everything. Second, scouting regularly and keeping the simple records. Walk your plant and at least once or twice a week, look under the leaves, note if you see anything, what plants that's at, how many were there, check the surrounding plants, do you see anything there? It's as cheap as a notebook or a phone notes app is all you need there. It's very cost effective. This early detection lets you act before resistance pressure even starts to build. Scouting turns you from a reactor into a strategist. Third, you're going to want to support biodiversity. Things like planting flowers, herbs, or hedgerows that feed the beneficial insects, and avoid wiping out everything with broad treatments. Healthy populations of ladybugs, lacewings, predatory mites, parasitic wasps do a lot of the heavy lifting for free. Fourth, use resistant or tolerant varieties wherever possible. Seed catalogs often list these traits, and once again, it's not a foolproof immunity, but it does buy you time and reduces the need for intervention. Fifth, you're going to practice good cultural basics. You're going to focus on crop rotation. So avoid planting peppers or related crops in the same spot year after year. Proper spacing, airflow, sanitation, make sure you clean up that debris and had a healthy soil building rotation in there. And these create great conditions where pests struggle and plants, they thrive. Now let's make this real for just different scales. For commercial farmers and larger operations as a whole, integrate these next few things into your overall farming plan. Work with groups like your local extension agents or consultants to develop the formal IPM program tailored for you and your region. Track resistance trends in your area. Using example like, Organic Valley Farms started to notice a declining result in their main insecticide group. They switched to rotating 3 different IRAC groups and beneficial nematodes, applications that are going straight to the soil, and planted border strips of flowering plants all around there. And so within 2 seasons, they reduced the total sprays and were able to maintain their yield. For backyard growers in small-scale gardens, you have the advantage here. Smaller plots means easier to observe, manage, and start simple. Make sure that when you're doing this, you're using row covers on your young peppers. Go ahead and hand pick early on those pests off your plant as best as possible and introduce a packet of ladybugs or beneficial nematodes when needed. Even rotating neem oil and insecticide soaps or BT throughout makes this a big difference. Your 6 plants can become a resistant oasis in the neighborhood, if you will. One more universal tip here. Stay curious and keep learning. Universal extension groups, resources, local master gardener programs, and reputable organic or conventional grower networks are gold mines. From what works in one climate or soil type might need a slight tweaking in another. So here's the big takeaway I want you to carry with you. Resistance isn't inevitable. It's a signal that our systems are needing more diversity and smarter management. So whether you're growing conventionally with precision, using chemistry, or organically with biological firepower, or maybe you're just somewhere in between, the principles are all the same. Observe, diversify, build resistance, and you can prevent instead of consistently chasing your problems. Peppers are just the example for today, but remember, this applies to your whole garden, your whole farm, and honestly, the broader food system. Growers who succeed long-term aren't the ones who win every single battle with one killer product. They're the ones that are out there who are building gardens and fields that can handle the pressure without falling apart. Resistance beats perfection every time. I hope that this episode gave you the practical ideas that you can try out this season, and maybe starting with better scouting and trying new resistant varieties or releasing some beneficial insects. Small changes compound. If you're dealing with resistance issues right now, go ahead, drop a comment or send over a voice note, reach out on socials, etc., and tell me what kind of crop you are fighting pests on. Or what has worked and stopped working for you? Things like, are you leaning organic, conventional, or a hybrid? The best stories and tips that I get will be shared and credited in a future episode. Your real world experience helps every single listener. And if this episode helped you think differently about your garden or farm, go ahead and do me a favor. Go ahead and share this out with another grower, another gardener, or another farmer who might need to hear it. Go ahead and subscribe, leave a review if you're on a platform that allows for it, and join the conversation. We're all in this growing game together. Don't forget, new episodes drop every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Central, with sponsorship opportunities open now for the podcast, as well as merch that is available on the podcast website. So head on over to theswearword.net or reach out on socials if you're wanting to get some of that sponsorship conversation going. Shout out for our current sponsors, podvision.io. If you're looking to grow your brand, start your brand, if you hit a bump in the road, you're trying to figure things out, highly recommend checking out podvision.io for all of those needs, as well as webdx.one. Maybe you have an online site. Maybe you had a guy at one point and lost contact. Maybe just never got around to building a website. Highly recommend checking out webdx.one. Best of all, they get you looking great, so you get to focus on what you do best. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your soil healthy, and your tactics varied. Grow smarter, not harder. I'm Brandon Swear, and from everything from the world of hot, this has been The Swear Word.